Hello. With this lecture, I would like to continue our exploration into Rudolf Steiner's theory of ethics. So we'll be taking the same topic, but I hope with this lecture to cast the same topic in a different light, something like a different aspect of the same question. And I hope that it will somehow aid in providing a more comprehensive understanding of this question. The last lecture is concluded with basically the idea that the way that we actually have we actually have freedom in our perception of the world, and we actually participate in our perception of the world. We take part in that perception in a way that we're often unconscious of. And I gave the example of the way in which the concepts that we entertain and basically the representation, the imagination that we create of a fellow person, this will determine whether or not we conceive of that person, whether we imagine that person as a friend or not. In other words, we're actually accountable in a way that we often overlook. We are actually accountable for whether or not we are friends with somebody, whether we're friendly with this person, whether we love this person. We are accountable for this in a way that we often don't notice. And this is in some way a recapitulation from the last video, because I tried to explain, or at least point to or suggest a way that that each of you can try to verify and confirm what I'm saying by paying attention to a certain process in your own perception and your own way of making sense of the world. And specifically, it had to do with the way in which we recognize what is before our eyes, so to speak, and the same sensory stimuli. We actually exercise a great deal of creativity in making sense of those sensations, basically in recognizing or comprehending what we see. We're actually playing a big part in it precisely by the way in which we connect concepts to those perceptions. This all by way mostly of recapitulation from the last lecture. Now, it's clear that if this is true, and we can begin to discover this place within our own cognitive and perceptual processes, this place that in fact we're not just confronting a world that is just sort of, that we're just running into this ready-made objective world that just kind of confronts us, but rather we are also, from within, we're also playing a part and playing a role, a creative role, in generating the same world that we at first imagine merely confronts us. It's clear that if we are able to recognize this, it will have profound implications in, well, first of all, this is kind of goes without saying, but the kind of place we think the world is. But by the same token, and because these are basically two sides of the same fact, the way we act in the world and what we think is good, what we think is the right thing to do in the world, is totally and ultimately contingent on what kind of place we think the world is. And so any knowledge about the world will of necessity inform our action in that same world. And so for this reason, ethics, well, so science or knowledge on one side and ethics on the other side, they are delineated as two separate subjects, but they're ultimately inseparable. And we might even imagine it by analogy, the way that if we have a candle, the candle is both light and also warm. And in some way those are different things, but they're not ultimately different things, they're different aspects of the same thing. And so in the same way we can think of science and morality, or science as ethics, or science and ethics, as two moments or two aspects, two viewpoints on the same thing. This is again largely a recapitulation of the last video, but I also think it's very essential to Steiner's view of ethics. He's trying to basically unite two things that we've often treated as separate. To quote Rudolf Steiner from the excerpt that you read from chapter 1 of Philosophy of Freedom, he says this basically, very explicitly. He says, and I quote, "What does it mean to have knowledge of the reasons for one's action?" Again, he's distinguishing actions that we perform with consciousness and with knowledge of our reasons for acting. He's contrasting these kind of actions with actions that we perform without such knowledge. We will continue to explore this topic later in the lecture. But so Steiner asked the question, what does it mean to have that knowledge of reasons for one's action? And he notes that too little attention has been paid to this question, because unfortunately it has been approached as though these two are separate things. He says, we have torn into two what is really an inseparable whole. The human being itself is an inseparable whole. And we've distinguished between the knower and the doer. And we have left out of account precisely the thing that is primary, the thing that matters most of all. And he says, this is the knowing doer. And so Steiner is in some ways trying to join these two aspects. Again, imagine by analogy, the analogy that I gave, the light and the warmth of a flame. He's trying to approach the question of ethics without imagining that those two are separate things, right? And to just return to this example from the last video, the notion of basically trying to understand or trying to achieve science or knowledge of the principle or the phenomenon or the experience of friendship or love, it's too the connection is too clear to just, despite that it's something of a tangent on this video. In fact, maybe it's less of a tangent than it might seem. The idea of achieving knowledge or insight or science into love, this is basically it's in some way the etymology, so the word origin of the word philosophy itself. It suggests this same kind of conjunction that Steiner calls the knowing doer. On the one side you have philia in the word philosophy, philo. This basically means love, it means friendship, it means affinity, it means connection. And then you have Sophia, and Sophia means wisdom. And so in some way philosophy itself, it points to just this same kind of conjunction between, it's basically love or affinity or connection, but that's also in some ways irradiated. So the warmth of love that's irradiated by the light of science, or the light of knowledge, the light of wisdom. And so in some way, right from the very beginning, by beginning I mean what Plato was writing 2,500 years ago. From the very beginning of Plato was the first person to use this word philosophy, and of course we're still using it today. Right from the very beginning of this tradition, it's contained these two aspects, but it's joined these two aspects. And so in some ways, philosophy, it's often translated as, philosopher is translated as lover of wisdom. One of the early translators, one of the early thinkers who was translating these Greek manuscripts of Plato into Latin was a thinker called Augustine, St. Augustine, Augustine of Hippo. This was sometime in the 5th century, I expect. And he famously translated the word philosopher into Latin as amator sapientiae, which means amator is amore is love. So it means lover of wisdom. And this is of course one way in which the word philosophy is understood, philosopher is understood. But another way it can be understood, and Plato kind of offers this viewpoint of the way we should understand the practice of philosophy, he offers this viewpoint in one of his famous dialogues called the Symposium. One way it can be understood is amatore sapientiae, or lover of wisdom. Another way it can be understood, though, is the wisdom of love, or the sort of the knowledge, the wisdom, the insight of love, the insight into love. And so I offer these two, they're not antithetical by any means, but they serve to basically cast the issue in slightly different light. And I do think it relates to what Steiner is trying to do, because he's trying to basically join both of these approaches together. Again, sort of the central point is the human being, that he says we all too often approach in a one-sided way. This was also something of a recapitulation from the last lecture, but we talked about how, in some way, the theories that we've been studying, and by theories these are basically just their approaches or viewpoints that attempt to conceptualize what makes a given action the right thing to do. We've discovered something of a progression between over the course of the different theories that we've studied. We talked about utilitarian ethics, which emphasizes the outcome of our actions, the ultimate fruits of whatever we do. We thought about that. Next, we covered ethics that emphasizes or centers on the deed itself, the action itself, and basically the motive within the deed itself. And we approached this, our representative for this way of thinking was Immanuel Kant. And so in some way we've moved from an outcome, which is kind of far downstream from ourselves. The outcome is far downstream. We've moved much closer. We've kind of ascended up a mountain, to use a metaphor, towards a source. We've ascended upwards towards a source. When we thought about the deed itself, this is upstream of the outcome of that deed. This was, and again, we used Immanuel Kant for a representative of this way of thinking. Next, we used Aristotle as our third representative, and this, in some way, it's accomplished a similar transition. But the transition is, again, it's kind of going upstream once again, and it's almost emphasizing not the deed itself, but rather not the concept. So the utilitarian ethics emphasizes the consequence, whatever happens consequent to the deed, which is to say the outcome, the consequence. With virtue ethics, for whom we used Aristotle as our representative. But again, there are many more. In some way, there's no human community on the earth that doesn't, in some way, approach ethics through in a kind of virtue ethics conception. And what I mean by this is, we are always holding up figures. Any society basically exalts and exalts given representatives of that for that society are sort of paragons of moral virtue. And again, these role models can exhibit very different virtues, but nevertheless, every society will recognize certain, often historical figures. In some way, we think of, in the United States, we think of people like Martin Luther King and Abraham Lincoln and George Washington. These are some way seminal figures in our history. And so again, we use Aristotle not because he's the only one, the only person to have articulated the conception of virtue ethics, but rather because he has articulated it with, he articulated it a long time ago, so he was one of the first ones. And he was also articulated it with exemplary clarity and precision in his terms. But we notice that when we're talking about virtues, as opposed to deeds, and then again as opposed to consequences of those deeds, when we're talking about virtues or traits of character, virtuous traits of character, we are in fact talking about not consequence of the deeds, but actually antecedents of the deed. So basically, traits of character come before a deed, whereas consequences come after the deed. And so then again, in some ways, we've moved one step closer to the center, one step closer to the source, one step closer to the origin. With Steiner, in some way, we've attempted to arrive at that very central point, the very origin, the sort of wellspring of these. Well, we've been studying the same thing, but just in some way in different moments of the same thing. With Steiner, though, we are attempting to arrive at the very origin of moral action. In some way, this is very challenging, precisely because before we could always, in some way, stand apart from what we were studying in some way. We could have some distance and study it objectively. But with Steiner's approach, we're actually asked to in some way study what we're asked to study the very thing that's studying. So the subject and the object are actually tasked with almost becoming the same thing, the subject and the object of this kind of inquiry. And so in some way that's it's quite challenging because it's a different approach than we're used to. At the same time, it might be easier because we don't, not exactly easier, but well, despite that it's challenging, it promises something very important, which is that if we can succeed in doing this, we will in some way have established a kind of almost like an Archimedean point or a basis for ethical action that is entirely within our own selves, and the virtue of that is that we won't have to depend on anyone else's testimony or authority or rules or order. We will be able to again discover the kind of origin of ethics within our own selves. And so again, on one hand, it's a challenge to make ourselves the object of our study, but in another sense, it promises something that maybe makes the challenge worthwhile. So again, just to recapitulate the way that these theories of ethics have progressed, it's gone from emphasizing an outcome or consequence to a deed, to an antecedent or a trait of character, and then finally, with Rudolf Steiner, to the agent itself, to the actor itself. Agent, actor, I've also called it an author. These are all terms that are meant to bring the emphasis to the creative and the sort of the almost artistic aspect of ethics to Rudolf Steiner. It's not as though we are following some set of rules. We're not trying to basically put ourselves in alignment with any kind of commandments or something. Rather, we're acting much like artists. We're actually creating something. We're generating something. We are giving birth to something. And so this is again, it's a clear progression as we've covered these different theories of ethics. I will try to, in this video, in this lecture, I'd like to specifically focus, the last one was in some ways, it placed a greater emphasis on Steiner says we should not separate the doer from the knower from the doer. We should think of the knowing doer. The knowing doer. So this is science and morality together. In the first lecture, I emphasized the knowing aspect. In this lecture, I will try to emphasize the doing aspect. Another way of thinking of this is that the first lecture emphasized the thinking side, or the perceptual side, the conceptual side. The second lecture will attempt to emphasize the active side, or the side that focuses not on thinking but on willing, on doing. And if I'm successful by the end of this lecture, anyone who's watching this will maybe have insights into Steiner's view, and also his or her own the structure of his or her own deeds, his or her own will, basically. That's really what it is. It's will. And so returning to an old friend from earlier in this same talk, Augustine of Hippo. He has a famous phrase. He's talking about basically whenever we do the opposite of what's moral, and for him this is sin. And he basically says very clearly, human beings sin from two causes. One is either not knowing the right thing to do, and the second is not doing what one knows to be the right thing to do. So here again, we have this clear conception of the two sides, the knowing or the thinking, and the doing or the willing. And Augustine says each of these deficiencies in either one of these sides are exactly what basically they preclude us from acting morally. So again, Steiner's approach is trying to address both of these sides, to not leave out one or the other, to integrate them. And so again, we're attempting to come at this by way of, with this lecture, specific emphasis on the will. In the last lecture, I contrasted Steiner's concept of freedom to the concept of freedom of several other thinkers. This was again an attempt to basically to achieve a comprehensive insight into the concept of freedom itself. In this lecture, I'm going to try to do something similar with the concept of will itself. I'm going to try to show how different thinkers have and different traditions have thought of will, and how and then to try to show how Steiner thinks about it in a way that doesn't exactly contradict or negate what the other thinkers have said, but it does in some way. It offers deeper insight into what these thinkers have said about will before. Ultimately, for Steiner, ethics is again it's not really it's both about we're both acting on the world, but at the same time we are acting on ourselves. And again, this comes to the idea of ethics as a subject in which as a subject in which we also become our own objects, our own. The subject of ethics is not something we can entirely separate ourselves from. And we've seen again this progression that utilitarianism manages to separate them to an extraordinary degree for this subject. But we can see that each one of these theories that we've studied basically brings them closer together. And again, Steiner attempts to really achieve this synthesis of the two, and so that we see that the object of our study of ethics and the subject, the one who's studying this object, become the same thing. And again, this is tantamount to arriving at that very origin of our deeds. But so for Steiner, when we talk about ethics, this is the theory of, or the concept of ethics, the meaning of ethics is inseparable from freedom. And this is something that we covered in the last lecture. But so there's one thing of freedom to act. There's another thing of freedom, the freedom to. There's one thing is freedom to act upon the world. Another thing is freedom to act upon yourself in some way, to form and to transform yourself. This, I think, shows real continuity between Aristotle's notion of virtue ethics as kind of cultivation of virtuous habits, But it's clear that in some way freedom is a necessary condition to be able to cultivate virtuous habits. Like, again, you have to be, you think of what is the agent, or what is the, who is working on whom, if we think about working on ourselves. In some way there's, there's not two things, so it's something's confusing, right? Because the same one that we're trying to change, that's the one that needs changing, so how does it work back upon itself? And somehow this paradox, though, it's accomplished when we, but it's only accomplished from the point of freedom. In other words, we have to be free not only to do what we want, but also to want what we want. And this is a fundamental distinction. Again, it's something that was treated more thoroughly in the last lecture. But moving on to the question of will, but not merely leaving behind everything that I've tried to array before us now. As I move to this question of will, I want to keep everything that has been mentioned until now. I want to sort of keep that before us and try to show how the question of will is continuous with everything that we've studied, and in some ways again, it's another aspect of everything that we've studied until now. For Steiner, basically, ethics is a question of, well, again, it's a creative thing. In other words, we're not just following rules; we are bringing something forth, and this has to do with, well, Plato often encounter in his dialogues. Socrates is often in conversation with people. A famous instance is in the Euthyphro dialogue, which we read earlier this semester. He's asking, what is piety? And the answer that Euthyphro gives, at first Euthyphro tries to answer the question by giving instances of piety, so pious deeds. And he says, it's piety to follow the law, for example. And Socrates that's not the question he's asking. He's asking rather, when he says, what is piety? He's not asking for an instance of piety. He's rather asking for the thing that makes that instance an instance, right? So you have to know what piety is to be able to recognize any instance of it. And so we can see that in some way, there's a relation between the instances and the thing of which they are instances. And so, but it's kind of, we recognize the instances of something by first knowing what that thing is. Steiner's idea of ethics is actually something very similar, but in some ways it's the same thing, but it's reciprocal. It sort of turns the direction around. And so whereas Socrates is kind of emphasizing the knowing side, Steiner brings he kind of completes Socratic or Plato's view of ethics by really articulating what's at stake with the doing side. And so while Socrates is kind of arriving at the abstract concept of whether it be piety, justice, virtue, Steiner is trying to help us discover the capacity and the ability and the freedom in ourselves that basically allow us to create, again, almost like artists or like authors, to create instances of virtue, of goodness, of whatever happens to be. Steiner is trying to provide us with the capacity and the freedom to create instances of these abstract concepts. So whereas in some way, just to give an image of this, Socrates is kind of drawing and collecting together instances to arrive at the universal. Steiner is helping us basically create instances or incarnate specific, in our concrete, individual, specific actions. In some way, our individuals, so human beings, free human beings, become something like, almost like apertures through that kind of individuate virtues into concrete actions. And as a recapitulation from the last video, the capacity that allows us to basically join the universal concept to a particular action is what Steiner calls moral imagination. So it's the ability to basically make a concrete, individuated picture of whatever virtue happens to be friendship, for example. It's one thing to know what friendship is, but it's another thing to be able to, it's not a separate thing, but it's also not exactly the same thing. It's kind of like so to be able to know what friendship is compared to be able to do friendship in any specific instance, this takes a capacity that Steiner calls, again, moral imagination. So again, we discover this kind of, again, artistic or creative element in Steiner's view of ethics. When we talk about the will, it's something very similar. And in some way, we are trying to, in some way with the will, we're actually, our creativity is also kind of turned upon ourselves. And in some way we are, the process of moral, ethical development or moral, ethical education, moral evolution, it can be, from Steiner's view, it can be perhaps very technically described as, suppose the way in which, so the creation or the evolution of the self, the moral self, is the same thing as the way in which we're able to unite consciousness with will. And again, we will discover, I think, that these two principles. It's the same that we discovered in the knowing doer. It's the same that we discovered in Sophia and Philia, philosophy. The same that we discovered in Augustine as sinning from two causes, not knowing and not doing. We have the idea of consciousness, or attention, and will. Now I will try to give before I pursue that line of thought in the way that Steiner takes it, I'm going to give a couple examples of different ways that will has been conceived. Different thinkers and different traditions that have conceived of the will in somewhat related but also somewhat contrasting ways to what Rudolf Steiner offers. One of them, and perhaps the first one that will come to many people's minds, is Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche. And for Nietzsche, basically, ethics or morality, he thought most people had basically made a mistake. In fact, beginning with Plato, people started making a mistake. And for Nietzsche, basically, what is good is literally, I basically verbatim quoting Nietzsche, he says, "What is good? All that enhances the feeling of power." So for Nietzsche, the idea is that the will of itself is good. This is, in some way, it's related to Steiner because he's looking for, for Steiner, morality is certainly related to some kind of intensification of the will. But for Steiner, it's not merely an intensification of the will, it's an intensification of the will through joining it with consciousness. So for Steiner, morality comes with conscious willing. And this, again, it's, in some way, it's the definition of morality, and that's also the same thing as freedom. And so for Steiner, ethics is freedom. But again, it's not straightforwardly like doing whatever I want. This is something that we considered in the last lecture. Again, in some ways, doing what I want is the opposite of freedom, because unless I want the right things first, then I'm actually better off, much better off, not doing what I want and not getting what I want. For Steiner, freedom actually means the ability to want the right things and the ability to basically develop myself and educate myself to want the right things. And clearly this is not just the same thing as getting what I want. Nietzsche doesn't make that distinction. For Nietzsche, it's clearly a question of the will to power. So obviously there's a important difference between Steiner's view of ethics and Nietzsche's view. This probably goes without saying, but I do think it's illustrative to compare any one viewpoint with other viewpoints because it helps to increase the sort of insight and comprehension into the question at stake. Almost the opposite of Nietzsche's view is a view that's a famous thinker and rough contemporary of Nietzsche. This person lived a little bit before Nietzsche, a little bit after Kant, and this is Arthur Schopenhauer. But Arthur Schopenhauer was likely significantly influenced by the Buddhist tradition, and I understand that it was just at that time in the mid to late 19th century that translations of Buddhist texts were first becoming accessible and popular within a certain group of thinkers in modern day Germany. This is before the unification of Germany. But so Schopenhauer was likely very influenced by the Buddhist conception of morality. And of course, we could spend our whole semester approaching ethics from the Buddhist perspective. And so this is a very rich and vast tradition. And in fact, it's a diverse tradition too. And so anything I say about Buddhism is going to be a sweeping generalization. But nevertheless, I think a generalization can be helpful as long as we keep in mind that that's what this is. So for Nietzsche, the essence of ethics is basically an increase of power. From the Buddhist perspective, with Nietzsche, it's an increase of will. From the Buddhist perspective, it's almost the opposite. The good is to be found in something like an abnegation of will, and so a kind of relinquishment of will, a relinquishment of desire, basically a complete. In fact, in some way the highest attainment of the Buddhist tradition. One tradition within the Buddhist tradition is the attainment of Nirvana. And Nirvana, it's a word in Sanskrit, and the etymology of the word basically relates to kind of extinction, or almost like you would blow out the candle, blowing out of the candle. And so this kind of Nirvana means basically an annihilation or nullification or extinction of will. And with Buddhism, it's really in some way the problem is not really what we first imagine the problem to be. We imagine that the problem is from the Buddhist perspective, the problem is that we are willing things, that we're desiring things, and it's clear I think it's clear from Nietzsche how just the idea of the will is an unqualified good. I think everyone has a sense how where that could lead and how dangerous it might be. And that's partly behind the Buddhist idea that because the kind of unchecked and untethered will, it can just as easily lead to harm and destruction as it can to anything good. That in fact maybe the best approach would be to stifle the will and in fact extinguish the will. In fact, though, what's from the Buddhist perspective, they really it's much more it's much deeper than that. It's much more insightful than that. It's a question rather not of you have to go to the source basically from the Buddhist view, and so it's not really a question of extinguishing the will. It's rather a question of extinguishing the willer or extinguishing the doer. So the idea in Buddhism, the ultimate attainment in Buddhism not so much an extinction or an abnegation of the will, but rather an abnegation of the self that's doing the willing. And from the Buddhist perspective, this offers, again, nirvana, release, freedom, liberation. Again, Schopenhauer's view of ethics was largely influenced by the Buddhist perspective. So basically, from the idea of Buddhism, all evil in the world comes from egoism in some way, a kind of self-will that is structured through self-interest. And so the clear solution is get rid of the self that's structuring that will. Again, so we have Nietzsche, who thinks of the good as just a pure increase in will. Then we think of Buddhist perspective that thinks of the good as an extinction of the willer, extinction of nullification of the will. We can also think of a tradition like, this is familiar from the last video, this thinker is familiar from the last video, Spinoza. And Spinoza had the idea that, this is recapitulation from the last video, but he had the idea that freedom is basically the kind of realization of lack of freedom. Basically the realization that in the same way that a leaf is not free, it's not free from the tree that it's growing from. It's not free from that tree. It's not even separate from the tree. It's the leaf is, when we say tree, we include the leaf in the tree. So for Spinoza, similarly, but now suppose the leaf was under the illusion that it was free. For Spinoza, the idea is that basically the way to approach morality is for the leaf to basically wake up to the fact that it's actually its freedom is an illusion, and in fact it's part of the tree that it's growing from. By analogy, for Spinoza, the kind of ethical task before human beings is to realize that we don't actually, in some ways, we're just like leaves of the tree of life or something. Specifically for Spinoza, the idea is that there's only one thing, one substance that ultimately exists, and that's God. And so basically, when we think that we're substances, or we think that we have independent existence, that we're under some kind of illusion, and our job is to basically see through that illusion. This actually has important similarities with Buddhism, because the idea from Buddhism, the kind of abnegation of the self, it's a little bit misleading, but again, it's hard to talk about these things that are it's hard to talk about absences. Language is basically designed to talk about what's present. It's very difficult to talk about the opposite of that with language. But basically the idea with Buddhism is that there's no self in the first place, and so the abnegation of the self consists in basically seeing through the fact that it's not there. But that's clearly something that has to be achieved through insight. So Spinoza's view is actually not so different than Buddhism. It's also not so different than another important tradition, which is Islam. And in fact, Islam, the name Islam, etymologically, I understand that it means surrender. And the idea in Islam is, again, quite similar to Spinoza's view. It's that, there is no God but God, and basically, again, everything, to use language from Spinoza, but it's pertinent to the view of Islam. It's that in some way we are all, the ethical development, and ethical realization would mean basically total and ultimate surrender to the no God but God. Now, Steiner's view is, as I've mentioned, it's not totally separate from these other views, his approach to the will. It's not totally separate, but it is different in important ways. And so now that I've kind of, again, arrayed these different viewpoints before us, I'm going to try to now pursue Steiner's view and but with the benefit of having laid out these contrasts. Now, Steiner has the idea certainly that that human beings are not like that we are certainly part of the universe, and we're not just little particles or atoms that are kind of like orphans that don't belong in the universe. Certainly, we are continuous with the universe. But he also has the idea that individuality and the self and the sense of I, that it's actually it's important. Like suppose we had a universe and we got rid of all of the stars in the universe. You might still have a universe, but you would be missing something really important. And by analogy, if we got rid of the self, if we got rid of this agent, this author, this I, this creative point, this original creative point, we would be getting rid of something very important. And so Steiner's idea is it's not the same as basically it's certainly not the same as the Buddhist view or Spinoza's view. It's also not the same as Nietzsche's view in the way that it's a sort of a straightforward intensification of the will to power. But again, in some way it's related to all these views, and I think that if I explain what Steiner has in mind in terms of kind of ethical development, I think it will be clear how it relates to these other views. His idea is basically, again, that morality and the moral self is something. It's like our own. It's our own we create our moral selves. We sculpt our moral selves. So it's a kind of formation and a transformation, and that formation or the development, the creation of the moral self, consists precisely in permeating our will with consciousness. And the fruition of this is freedom. And the fruition of this is to be able to act for reasons that one has become conscious of, and for reasons that are one's own reasons. So basically, to give a picture of this, we can think of something like force, the laws. So like physical laws and force, the force in terms of the way physics would think of force. So like dropping a rock. If I drop a stone, the stone, if I lift it up, it has potential energy, and the minute I release it, it's kinetic energy and force, and it will strike whatever is beneath it with force. If we think of, though, something happens, the rock is a lifeless thing. Living things, they begin to, in some way, and the force of a rock with gravitation, it depended on my own hypothetical intelligence to basically imbue it with that kind of force. And so the rock by itself, it didn't exactly prefer one thing or the other. It didn't structure the force in any intelligent way. This is, I guess, the transition that I'm trying to point to. It's that living things suddenly begin to structure what we otherwise, in terms of pure physics, what we otherwise call force. So if we think of the way that a tree or a plant, a flower, it doesn't just kind of collapse into a big pool of enzymes and atoms. There's a sort of intelligence within the organism. An organism is quite an expressive word if we think of that word. It's etymologically, it really means kind of energizing, working. So it works on the force. It structures the force and creates something that's ordered, right? So whatever the organism has to be, life So in some way, life is a kind of intensification or intensification of force, or a way in which force is begins to intelligence begins to inform force. So brute force becomes intelligent force. If we move from a plant to an animal, we see a further intensification, and it begins to move from basically force, structured force, to consciousness begins to flicker, and it moves from structured force that forms a plant to instinct in animals. And even in the most not primitive, but in some way the most rudimentary instincts in animals. So something like the way that wasps know how to make paper. They don't do this through knowledge so much as through instinct. They're basically born knowing how to do this, and all animals inherit this kind of instinct. But so we suddenly, when we move from structured force in a plant to instinct in an animal, suddenly we begin to recognize what we call will. And we might, without the intermediary steps of structured force in plants, in organisms, in life, without that intermediary phase and without instinct, we might not recognize will as a metamorphosis of brute force, the force of physics. But these intermediary steps allow us to see, they're like a theory that allows us to see a connection that otherwise might escape us. We move from force to structured force, force structured by intelligence, by an organism, to instinct, and suddenly we are in the domain of will. By analogy, we can imagine the way that there's an electromagnetic spectrum, and a part of that spectrum is visible. On one side is not visible, the other side is not visible. You have infrared on one side, and you have ultraviolet on the other side, and X-rays. And neither one of these extremes of the spectrum is visible, but there's a visible spectrum in the middle. And by analogy, we've moved into that spectrum now, the spectrum of will, within force, of will, once we talk about instinct. Because within our own selves, our own will, we recognize our instinct. Whenever I blink, for example, this is a kind of, it's an instinct. It's an intelligence. It's an intelligence or a kind of a specific structure in my will, but that I don't do it with consciousness or for a reason so much. I don't do it for a reason that I'm conscious of. It just sort of happens, again, by instinct. And we inherit all of our physiology, the wisdom of our physiology, and even we basically live by it through an inheritance of this wisdom, this instinctual wisdom. That again, it's will, but it's very only very dimly conscious. It's mostly unconscious, mostly subconscious. But we can recognize now the way the similarity and the continuity between our will as when it operates as instinct, and then I'm going to list almost a spectrum. And so the same way we have 7 colors of the rainbow in the visible spectrum, by analogy I'm going to list something like 7 different gradients of will. And these gradients are determined by the degree to which the will is imbued or permeated or interpenetrated with consciousness, with awareness, with thinking. And beginning with instinct, this is the least interpenetration. We can move to something like urge or drive. Urge, drive. We can next move instinct, urge, drive. Next we can say motive. And motive is clearly some kind of inflection point, because when we think about a drive, we're not thinking of something that we so much, well, we do it, but it also almost does us. Like we certainly don't don't resolve to perform a given drive. It's rather we're kind of moved by the drive. Clearly we're moved by instincts, we're moved by urges, we're moved by drives. We get to motive, and this is something of an inflection point. It's almost the way in which the green color of the spectrum, it moves from the kind of the warm colors, red, orange, yellow. There's an inflection point. Green moves to the cool colors after that, blue. Motive is something like that, where suddenly when we talk about motive, we're certainly participating in motive with our consciousness. Motive is the fourth gradient of this spectrum. We move from motive then to intention. So clearly, motive to intention, we are again continuing on this trend of, deeper and more insight or more interpenetration of our willing with consciousness. So when we have an intention, this is clearly something, it doesn't just act upon us, but we rather participate in it cognitively. So instinct, urge, drive, motive, intention, wish is number 6, and resolution is number 7. So clearly by the time we get to resolution, this is resolutions are certainly not something that just happen by themselves. Resolutions are something we deliberately, we think them out and then we carry them out. So they originate as pure ideals or pure thoughts, and then we carry them out. But the way we carry them out, again returning to a topic from the last video, is by exercising our moral imagination, and basically to find a way to concretize or individuate or instantiate the resolution into particular instances, particular actions. So by the time we get to resolution, it's a clear picture of the application of will, and some of the application of force, the application of will, but that's entirely transilluminated by consciousness or by insight. And so this then gives us a picture of what Steiner has in mind with freedom. It's basically action that originates as resolution, as pure thought. In other words, it's not conditioned by something outside of our own resolution. And then we are able to carry it out. We can again imagine, we started on one end of we laid out a spectrum now, and we began on, by analogy, outside of the visible spectrum on one side with pure force, and we entered the visible spectrum with instinct, and now we can exit the visible spectrum with resolution. We can exit it on the other side, and on the other side, if we think of what is kind of beyond will, outside of will, we might think of something like pure ideas, or pure thought, or pure logic. These are things that, again, they're kind of on the opposite side of the spectrum to basically physics. Nevertheless, by arraying them in such a spectrum, we're able to discern a continuity and something like a metamorphosis of will, beginning at something that's not quite will, becoming will, and then in some way transcending will. This, I think, is probably a good place to stop. The last thing I'll say is that by the time we get to resolution, again, we've arrived at something that is, we've arrived at something that's qualitatively different than what has come before it. And it's when we cross the threshold from resolution to something beyond resolution. And here we see basically that that once we intensify consciousness in the will so much that it almost can't take the will with it. Like once we get to pure ideas or pure thinking, this in some way it risks leaving the will behind. but maybe it doesn't have to be that way. And this in some way, we're once again confronted with Steiner's concept of freedom. Because again, if we think of freedom not as being able to do what I want or to get what I want, but really to be able to want what I want. In other words, to transform myself, to work upon myself, and basically take my own development in hand in order that I might want the right thing. Again, this is clearly, it's not just the kind of ordinary libertarian freedom that we might think of, or the liberal freedom of being able to act without external constraint. Rather, the freedom to change myself from resolution, to make a resolution to change myself. This is clearly some kind of almost transcendental freedom. It's a freedom that is in some way a condition for talking about ethics itself. We have to in some way be able, we have to be free to care about ethics. We have to be free to even want to do the right thing in the first place. This is probably a good place to leave it with that thought, and I hope that that something that I have said in this lecture can inspire any kind of ideas and insights in anyone who has been watching. And I of course welcome any kind of comments, and I hope to continue this discussion. And the last thing to be done is to wish everyone the very best and to bid everyone farewell until next time.